Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, and we're expecting a ton more people. So I think we might get started with just some introductory items and some housekeeping rules, and then we'll jump into the presentation and the open house for this evening. So good evening, everyone, and thank you again to everyone who's been able to join us. My name is Matt Rodriguez, and I'm a planner at WSP, the consulting firm working with the township on this rural zoning bylaw review. This meeting is the first round of public open houses and the final in a series of 3 that we've had over the past couple of weeks for the rural zoning bylaw review project. The objective of this meeting is to introduce the project and to seek input and your thoughts onto the types of issues with the current zoning bylaw framework. So up on your screen is the agenda for this evening. So we'll just walk through a couple housekeeping items with the meeting platform that we're using today, and then we'll have Bobby Gauthier from WSP walk through a number of items in a presentation, including the project purpose and background, some background into what the zoning bylaw is, and then a number of key issues and opportunities that our team has been looking at so far. After Bobby's presentation, we will jump into a question and answer period, and we'll provide a bit more detail of how that'll work once we get to that stage of the evening. During this session, please type your intention to speak or your question and comment in the chat box. So as we go, feel free to type in your question so you don't lose it. And your question will be answered in the order they were received during the question and answer period. So we won't take questions during the session, but please feel free to type them in as we go, and we'll certainly get to those as we go. And just a reminder, due to the COVID-19 restrictions and the evolving public health guidelines that we're under regarding limited gatherings and to maintain physical distancing, this meeting is being held virtually. And as you may have heard at the beginning, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the township's website at a later date for those who are unable to attend this evening or may have want to follow up. We'll also be posting the other sessions that were held last week, so there's certainly lots of information should you want to go back to those. So we just wanted to provide a quick introduction to who's on the call today. So from King Township, we have Kristen Harrison. She's the policy planner at the township and managing this project. And then as I mentioned, my name is Matt Rodriguez, and I'm with WSP, a planner, the consulting firm working with the township, and my colleague Bobby Gauthier, who's a senior project manager and is managing this project on the consulting team side. I'd also want to pass the microphone maybe over to Kristen right now, just to say maybe a couple of words and introduce some other township staff and members of council who might be on the call this evening.
Great, thanks so much, Matthew. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making time to be with us here this evening on this virtual open house. We're excited to hear from you and your thoughts on this project moving forward. And listening in on the call this evening, we have Mayor Steve Pellegrini, as well as Councillor Schaefer and Councillor Boyd. And from township staff, I see that we have Stephen Naylor, the Director of Growth Management Services, as well as I see Jamie Smythe, our Economic Development Officer, and I see that we have Kelly Early, our Zoning Examiner, and Giuliano Lamoliette, and he's a planner with the township. And I think that's it that I see from staff at this moment. If I've missed anyone, I'm sorry. So thank you again all for being here, and I'll turn it back over to Matt. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thanks, Kristen. There was a chat that someone might not be able to hear, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Perhaps there might be a setting on your end to play with if the volume isn't coming through. But I can certainly message you after we get started and try and troubleshoot that. So before I pass the floor over to Bobby for the presentation, I just wanted to go over again a couple housekeeping items with the platform that we're using today, the GoToMeeting platform. So as I mentioned, the meeting is being recorded, and we ask you to keep your microphone on mute throughout the meeting, just to avoid any distractions. But we welcome you to unmute yourself during the question and answer period when you're called upon to share your question. As I mentioned, please feel free to use the chat function as we go to share your ideas, questions, and thoughts. And just be sure to select the everyone option in the chat box. It's this little bubble here on the, it's this little bubble here on the top right corner. And if you select everyone, that'll go to everyone on this meeting. So please make sure that's selected when you're answering or entering your questions. Make sure I have everything. Okay, I think that's everything on the housekeeping side. So now I'm going to pass the floor over to Bobby Gauthier from WSP, and he'll walk through a brief presentation in about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll head into the question and answer period.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt, for the intro. Much appreciated. Just as a quick tip, if people are still having some audio issues, I think the setting that you might want to check out is at the top right. There's sort of like a gear-looking icon, and it opens up a panel and it lets you select your microphone and your speaker. So that might help to resolve some of those issues. So thanks so much for the intro, and really glad to see everyone. We're happy to be here, and we're happy to be introducing this project to you and getting going on it. It's a very important planning project for the township, and we're quite excited to be working once again with the township. So the purpose of today's open house is principally to introduce the project. This is our first series of open house sessions. We're at 3 of 3 for tonight. And the purpose of these sessions has been to introduce the project. This is our first round of consultation, and we want to come out to the community before we get too far into things and start to get some feedback and input on the zoning bylaw as we move forward. The purpose of the project, I'll describe it briefly in a nutshell here, but I'll keep elaborating on that as we move through. The main purpose of the project is to develop a new zoning bylaw for the township's various rural areas. So the purpose of the project is to review the existing zoning. You may know, if you're familiar with zoning in the township, that the township is largely subject to Bylaw 74-53, which was completed and produced back in the 1970s. This will really be the first totally thorough review of that zoning bylaw document. Next slide, please, Matt. So in terms of the study area, so what is the rural area that we're describing? What are we actually producing this new zoning bylaw for? So on the screen, you can see a map showing yellow shaded areas. Those yellow shaded areas are part of our study area. So you can see that it encompasses the great majority of the land area of the Township of King. The portions of land not in our study area include the 3 villages, Schaumburg, King City, as well as the Nobleton urban area. So we won't be amending the bylaws in those areas at this point. Next slide, please. So I think it's fair to characterize, this project is really the last phase in the zoning bylaw review process. You may know that the township has completed zoning bylaws in King City, Schaumburg, and Nobleton. And I was involved in those projects and very happy to be. And now, after a couple of years, the township is looking to wrap up all of that review and to complete the new zoning for the entirety of the township. So this rural area zoning bylaw is really the last phase of the zoning review process. Next slide, please. So what is a zoning bylaw before we get a bit too far into this? I think it's probably fair to say everybody on the line has some sense or some degree of familiarity with zoning bylaws, but I'll provide a bit of a high-level description. So zoning bylaw is a municipal bylaw. It's a bylaw that's passed and enforced by the Township of King, and it's used to regulate use of land. It's used to regulate the size of lots, the character, the location, and the height of buildings and structures. So it's a very detailed bylaw, and it's pretty key. It tells you what you can do, what kinds of activities on your property you can have, what's permitted, and what would require a process to be able to add those uses. It talks a lot about different lot and building requirements. So there are minimum setback requirements. So how far from the lot lines does a building need to be located? The zoning bylaw tells you how tall you can have a building. It can have provisions regarding massing. It can have provisions regarding accessory uses like decks, sheds, and fences. Commonly, zoning bylaws will manage and regulate lot coverage. So what proportion of your lot can you cover with buildings and structures? You'll find provisions for lot size. So how wide does your lot have to be? In other words, what is the minimum required frontage? And you'll find provisions for driveways and other matters. So suffice it to say, a zoning bylaw is very detailed and it's quite key. In terms of how you use a zoning bylaw, if you've used a zoning bylaw before, I think most people, what they'll do is they'll flip to the back and they'll look at the zoning map. They'll find their property and they'll try to identify, what zone code applies to my property. So when you find it on the zoning map and you identify maybe you're in R1 zone, you go back to the text of the bylaw and you can check out what provisions apply in the R1 zone. So that's basically how a zoning bylaw works. And finally, the township's authority to pass zoning bylaws falls under the Ontario Planning Act. So it's provincial legislation that allows the township to produce and pass and enforce zoning bylaws. So the zoning bylaw that we develop through this process is going to have to be consistent with the requirements of the Planning Act. So only certain things can be regulated by zoning bylaws. So we want to make sure that we're fitting within those parameters of the Planning Act. Next slide, please, Matt. So what does the existing zoning look like in the rural area? And we used what's called GIS data. So we used geographic-based data using the township's information about existing zoning. We created this nice color map to try to characterize all the different zone categories in the township today. What you can see pretty clearly is, a very large swath of the township is zoned with various Oak Ridges marine zones. So the township passed those zones a number of years ago, and now they currently apply to the bulk of the township. And that, of course, coincides with the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan. And I'll talk about that plan a little bit later. The remaining areas of the rural portions of the township are zoned a variety of different zones. There's different rural zones. There's a few different agricultural zones as part of that. There are instances of residential. There's even some instances of some commercial and industrial zones in the rural area, and those likely relate to previously approved zoning amendments to allow some sort of development to move forward. So that's sort of how I would characterize the existing zoning. Next slide, please. So if we zoom into the hamlets, now the hamlets of the township are part of the study area. If we zoom into the hamlets to take a look at the zoning, what you'll find, at least in these three hamlets, is that the bulk of the zoning is HR, hamlet residential. So it kind of begs the question, is the hamlet residential zone appropriate, right? So we see it applied in multiple different hamlets. Does it need to be broken down? Does it properly reflect the character of these different neighborhoods? So that's something that we'll be looking at. Next slide, please, Matt. So looking at some of the other hamlets, a little bit of a different situation. Lloydtown, largely zoned HR, but some of the other hamlets, more of a mix of different zones, including some rural zones, including some environmentally protected areas, and some other instances of zones, again, to reflect sort of what's there now. So we'll be looking to review these zones in the hamlets through this process. Next slide, please. I think you went backwards there. Next slide. Perfect. So how are we going to be conducting this review process? So far I've been talking about, the purpose of the project, what zoning is, a little bit about some of the objectives of ours, but how are we going to go about completing this brand new zoning bylaw for the rural area? So we're conducting the project in the course of about 1.5 years, and coincident with 3 phases. We're in phase 1, we're just starting the project now. Phase 1 consists of producing a discussion paper, and I'll be presenting the discussion paper as part of this discussion today. The discussion paper is really the basis for producing the new zoning bylaw. As the consultants to the township, we need to take some time and wrap our heads around what kinds of changes are going to be required to the zoning, to implement different policy and so on. So the discussion paper is our chance to wrap our heads around what kind of work is involved in this process. A lot of opportunity for consultation in phase 1. That's where we are now. We're in the consultation process for phase 1. I'll be showing you the project website at the end of the presentation to show you different opportunities to provide input there. We're contemplating topic-specific workshops or one-on-one discussions next year. A little bit more on that later. And phase 1 will culminate in a presentation to council. So once we've received some input on the discussion paper, I'll be presenting that to council early in the new year. Phase 2 involves developing the draft rural zoning bylaw. So using the discussion paper as the basis for the changes that we need to make, we'll write the draft zoning bylaw with the intent of releasing that document in June of next year. Okay, so if you're interested in seeing the draft bylaw, that's when you can expect it to be released. When we do release it, we'll conduct a series of open houses. It might look something like this. Kind of depends on how COVID plays out. I'd love to get out to the community and meet with people in person, but we might be a little bit limited in our ability to do that. So if that is the case, we'll conduct virtual consultation. We'll keep things moving, connect with the community, and we'll keep things up to date on the website, and we'll also be open to stakeholder meetings. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I wonder if everyone can make sure they're on mute. That would be appreciated, thanks. And then we'll move into phase 3 in the project. Phase 3 involves finalizing the bylaw based on the input we've received. So like I said, we'll release it in June. We'll make some revisions based on the comments we receive, and then we'll bring it forward for a statutory public meeting, a public meeting with council in the fall of next year. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the timeline. Next slide, please. So why is the project being completed? Why has the township decided we need to update the rural zoning bylaw? I've got a few points on that. So I think one of the key points is we need to make sure that the rural zoning bylaw, the new rural zoning bylaw, is going to implement the township's new official plan. I'll talk a bit more about the official plan in the next slide, but suffice it to say the township has a new guiding document, a new sort of vision for the future. And it's important that we address that in the new zoning bylaw. In fact, it's a requirement of the Planning Act that when you produce a new zoning bylaw, you're reviewing it to ensure conformity with policy. I'll talk about that a bit later. I think producing a new zoning bylaw is a great opportunity to modernize the existing zoning bylaw, something that's easier to use, something that people can understand more clearly, something that people can look up their zoning themselves very easily and get a sense of it. That's the kind of thing that we want to achieve in this process. Illustrations, clear definitions, and that sort of thing. And then I also think it's an opportunity to reflect recent trends, modern development practice, modern farming practice. It's a fairly old zoning bylaw, so does it reflect modern rural uses and modern farming practices and modern businesses? I should think it probably is out of date in that regard, so we'll be looking to make updates. Next slide, please. Relationship with the official plan. So I've been mentioning the official plan on pretty much every slide in this presentation. The official plan is a really important document. If you're not familiar with it, it is the township's adopted kind of guiding beacon for the future. It's a policy document. It's the document that tells the township and it gives them guidance about how to make decisions on planning. It even gives guidance on zoning. So in the official plan, which you can access on the township's website, you'll find land use designations, and you'll find policies around what kinds of land uses are permitted in different areas of the township. And it's really important for us in this project that we turn those high-level explanations and requirements for permitted uses into zoning regulations. We gotta reflect that. I always use the phrase, the zoning bylaw has to conform to the official plan. What does that mean? The way I like to describe it to people is to say that, generally speaking, a zoning bylaw cannot be more permissive than the official plan. So if the official plan is not allowing something to occur, the zoning bylaw cannot allow more of that to occur. It can't allow expansions and it can't allow new uses to occur if the official plan doesn't allow for it. We got to make sure these the bylaw and the official plan are totally in sync. Next slide, please, Matt. So the draft discussion paper. I'm kind of moving now into the second half of the presentation. The first half of the presentation, I've been talking a lot about the process and the requirements for the project, but now I'd like to shift gears and talk about our draft discussion paper, which we're introducing everyone to for input. So like I said earlier, the discussion paper is our first key deliverable in the project. It reviews a whole bunch of issues and it gives some kind of sense as to what kinds of changes are going to be required in the zoning bylaw as a result of this process. I think if you're kind of new to the process, if you're new to zoning, you might find the discussion paper to be a good resource in terms of explaining what zoning is, explaining these different policy documents and how they relate to the zoning bylaw. So it's a good contextual resource. Next slide, please. So the main aspect of the content of the discussion paper is that it reviews a series of 14 issues and opportunities. I view this as kind of being a list of largely the key changes that we're going to make in this process, but it's not to say that we're going to limit ourselves to this. I think these are just kind of the key ones that might benefit from consultation, you know, more policy direction kind of stuff, and less heavy on the technical stuff. So that's what you'll find in the discussion paper, is a more high level discussion of these issues, some options for addressing the issues, and then some preliminary recommendations to move forward. So I've got a slide for each one of these issues, so I'll just walk through that with you now. Okay, so the first issue or opportunity that we're addressing in this process is sort of the question of how should we package up the new rural zoning bylaw? You know, is it desirable to keep the rural zoning bylaw separate as a standalone bylaw, or is there some benefit in terms of consolidating the existing urban area bylaws that I talked about earlier, Nobleton, King City, Schaumburg, and integrating that with the rural bylaw so that there's just one new bylaw for the entire township? You know, I think suffice it to say that, you know, there's pros and cons to either approach, and fundamentally it's more of an administrative decision. So I think, you know, WSP, myself, I'm open to feedback and hearing some direction about how we want to move forward. Next slide. The Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the presentation. I'm sure everyone's got at least heard, you know, the term Oak Ridges Moraine. You may know that the province has a pretty detailed plan for the Oak Ridges Moraine, you know, landform feature. The plan provides pretty prescriptive regulations around what kinds of uses are permitted within its area. And like I showed on an earlier slide, the Oak Ridges Moraine affects a very large swath of the township's land mass. So it's going to be really important in this project that we update the zoning and we make sure that we're permitting uses consistently with that Oak Ridges Moraine plan, because it is so prescriptive. Next slide. The third issue we're looking at is we want to, you know, take a close look at the zoning in the hamlet areas. And I've provided a little bit of commentary about this earlier, but I'll reiterate. There's a couple of things we want to do. You know, the first thing is we need to make sure that the zoning in the hamlets is properly reflecting the character of the hamlets. You know, I mentioned earlier, you see this HR zone being applied amongst all these different hamlets, all these different neighborhoods. And it kind of begs the question, is it a suitable zone to reflect the unique characteristics of these different neighborhoods? Or do we need to be breaking it down and thinking about it a little bit more? So that's something we'll be looking at. We're also gonna have to look at land use compatibility matters. The official plan has introduced some changes to land use designations, and we're gonna have to make sure that the zoning lines up with the official plan's vision and intent for the hamlet areas moving forward. Next slide. Just take a sip of water. So the next topic is secondary residential units. So this is referring to accessory dwellings, you know, where you've got a single attached residence on a lot. Maybe you want to have a basement apartment, or maybe you're contemplating a second unit in a detached structure. At the end of the day, changes to the Planning Act and also the township's new official plan, you know, generally support the creation of these units as a form of affordable housing supply. They're also permitted in certain areas of the Oak Ridges Moraine, and I mentioned earlier we ought to make sure that we're being very much in sync with the Oak Ridges Moraine plan. And I think there are some gaps. So the zoning bylaw is not fulsomely addressing this issue the way that policy calls for it to be addressed. So I expect we'll have to make some changes to the permissions and the requirements on this use through this process. Next slide. Number 5, the Holland Marsh specialty crop area, situated at the far north end of the township. You know, we're kind of asking the question, you know, does the zoning in the Holland Marsh area reflect the specific characteristics and the unique attributes of the Holland Marsh? You know, in terms of lot size, in terms of character, in terms of crops, you know, does the zoning line up with the vision for this area, or would it benefit from some improvements? So we'll certainly be looking at that. Next slide, please. Small farm holdings, kind of the same thing. Small farm holdings refer to existing smaller farms that don't meet the new minimum lot area requirements. And it kind of just raises the question, do we need to be updating the provisions for small farm holdings to address those kind of unique characteristics? Next slide. Agriculture-related uses. So agriculture-related uses, it's a provincial term, and it refers to a use, a rural use in the rural area that serves a broader farming community. So it might be something like farm equipment repair use, or it might be something like grain drying, grain storage, and maybe a broader farmer's market that kind of brings in crops from all over the community. That's an agriculture-related use. Generally speaking, the official plan considers them, but it does provide quite a bit of criteria around them. So usually to permit an agriculture-related use, you'd probably have to go through a site-specific rezoning. However, I think that through this rural zoning bylaw review process, we can set up a new zone. We can set up sort of a baseline zone that the township can use, and they can apply when someone makes an application for a rezoning process. So I think there's an opportunity here to set standards for future agriculture-related uses. Next slide. On-farm diversified uses, another provincial term. I get them confused too, don't worry, there's so many of them. On-farm diversified use is a little bit different from an agriculture-related use. So an on-farm diversified use refers to more of an accessory use to a farm operation. So it's not something necessarily broadly serving the community, but it's more about adding a new opportunity for an existing farm. So it might be a home occupation or an industry, like you're farming your land, but you're also repairing some stuff on the side. That might be an on-farm diversified use. Agritourism, value-added uses. You're making cheese, you're making products out of the produce that you're producing on your farm. So I actually think that the zoning bylaw can contemplate permissions for on-farm diversified uses as of right. So we can include criteria and requirements, things like maximum lot size, setbacks, and that sort of thing. And we can add some permission for these things. I think there's a good intent here. This is about supporting farm viability and economic viability in the rural area. And I think we can advance that objective through the zoning bylaw review very directly. Next slide. So bed and breakfasts and short-term accommodations. Bed and breakfast, fairly obvious term. I think everybody has a sense of what that is. Someone owns a home and they rent a few rooms in the home and they kind of conduct that as a commercial business, but they also live there. So it's kind of this mixed use. Short-term accommodations is a broader term. So a bed and breakfast is a type of short-term accommodation, but I think what we're seeing with Airbnb and sites like that, increasingly people are maybe renting out a portion of their home or maybe even renting out the whole home for the purposes of accommodating people on a short-term basis. And there are some benefits to that in terms of economic support to the person who owns the home, but there can be some negative impacts in communities as well. Certainly I think I've read a whole bunch of articles just in the past year about people purchasing a home and renting it out via Airbnb, and creates all kinds of issues. So I think ultimately in this zoning review process, we can regulate these things. We can set requirements, we can restrict them, and we can add permissions where it's appropriate to do so. Next slide. Major recreational uses. So major recreational uses include things like golf courses, service playing fields. I'm getting a bit of feedback, if you wouldn't mind going on mute to the person who just joined us. Thank you very much. Campgrounds and ski hills. Generally speaking, these uses are pretty restricted in the rural area, especially within prime agricultural areas. But there is a process that exists in the region's official plan and the township's official plan to consider them. I think an official plan amendment is typically required to bring forward a use of this nature. So I don't think that in this process we're going to be looking to permit new uses as of right where they don't exist today. But what we can do in this process is set minimum standards. We can set requirements and provisions for when someone does come forward with a proposal for a golf course. We can, again, have that baseline set of standards, that the township is going to evaluate the application on. So I see us maybe creating a new golf course or major recreational zone or something of that nature. We'll probably apply it to some of the existing golf courses, but it would normally only be applied through a rezoning process. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Source water protection. So you may know that the province has introduced, pretty comprehensive legislation as well as a series of source water protection plans throughout the province. And they've been doing this for quite a number of years. And there is a source protection plan in effect, or multiple in effect. And the township does have wellhead protection areas. So, those refer to the area just around a well where water is being drawn, where uses have to be restricted in some manner to ensure that they're not going to impact the drinking water source. So the Clean Water Act includes some provisions and requirements around, what kinds of uses are permitted and should not be permitted. So I think it stands to reason that, the zoning bylaw is a good tool to implement that. This is something that was done also in the previous zoning bylaws for the villages. If you look at where the wellheads are, they largely apply to the villages, although, fairly extensively in the rural area. So I think we'd want to be consistent with the approach taken for the urban area zoning review. So we'd be looking to carry forward those provisions. Next slide. Natural heritage and hazards. Yeah, I certainly think that the zoning bylaw plays a role when it comes to helping to conserve and protect the environment. I certainly think at a minimum, we're going to be creating a new, environmental protection zone and basing that on an existing environmental protection zone and perhaps clarifying permissions more consistently with policy. And I think, there is an opportunity to look at the application of that zone and to consider how it may be expanded on the basis of recently completed studies. So that's what we'd be looking to do in this process. Next slide. Sustainability and climate change. Yeah, I think the rural zoning bylaw, again, it has a role to play when it comes to supporting some of these public policy objectives. And we had a few ideas about how that might play out. So one is that through the zoning bylaw, we can introduce requirements for pervious surfaces. So we can set sort of a minimum number or a minimum percentage of a lot that needs to be pervious. It needs to allow water to infiltrate into the ground. I don't think that kind of requirement has a lot of relevance in an agricultural zone necessarily, but certainly I think it could be quite relevant in the hamlets. So that's something we'd be open to looking at. If you look at the King City, Schomberg, and Nobleton bylaws, you'll see that that was something that was introduced in those bylaws. So we'd be looking to see if there's relevance in the rural area. I also think that there's a role in the bylaw in terms of supporting a local food network. So in particular, if we're looking to update and expand permissions for on-farm diversified uses, like I talked about before, I think there's an opportunity to help strengthen the township's access to local food and residents' access to local food, and maybe help to connect residents directly with local farmers. So I think that's sort of another way that we can indirectly support sustainability and climate change related objectives. And then finally, like I've mentioned before, we do have an opportunity in this process. We can update the zoning for hazardous lands on the basis of detailed studies. So next slide. This is the last issue, the 14th issue that you'll find in the discussion paper. Again, this isn't a fulsome list of all the issues we're going to address, but we're touching on all the key ones. At least we hope we are. And if there's others, let us know. And another topic, cannabis production uses. The township's been quite keen and ahead of the game when it comes to regulating cannabis. They produced a zoning amendment in 2018, but that was just prior to federal legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes. So in other words, the federal and the provincial legislation on cannabis has evolved a lot since then. And I know the township has been looking at revisions to that bylaw. It's a fairly complex topic because there's all kinds of different scales of cannabis operations. They do different things on their property. There's different regulations that apply. It's hard to navigate the whole thing. But I do think that we have the opportunity in this process to set some provisions that are going to be appropriate for these uses. Next slide. So that kind of wraps up the presentation. So I've been talking for a while. I've gone over the process, the objectives in the project, and I walked through at a high level 14 of the key issues that we want to address in the project. In terms of staying informed and some of our next steps, absolutely encourage everyone to sign up for updates on the project as we move forward. The link to the website is there. I'll be demonstrating the website momentarily. Feel free to reach out to Kristen if you have any questions or comments. In terms of our next steps, so we're going to be starting work on the first draft of the rural zoning bylaw imminently, internally as a working document. And in February of next year, we're kind of thinking about and looking at opportunities for additional consultation. So if people want to have one-on-one meetings, we're quite amenable and open to doing that if you want to dive into some topics. We're also thinking about potentially some topic-specific workshops. If we're finding that a lot of people want to kind of talk about the same thing, it might make sense to just kind of bring everybody together and have a workshop. So feel free to reach out to Kristen if you have any thoughts on that. We're looking to finalize the discussion paper by mid-February. So we are asking for comments on the discussion paper by mid-January. That's not a hard deadline for comments. We're going to keep accepting comments throughout the process. So please feel free to keep feeding comments. But for us to ensure that we can address your comments before I bring the discussion paper to council, we are asking for comments by mid-January. And then, like I said earlier, you can expect to see the first draft of the bylaw will be released in June of next year, and we'll conduct some consultation. Depending on the circumstances of the day, we'll conduct some consultation. So please keep informed by visiting the website. We'll keep that up to date in terms of announcements on our consultation process. So with that, Matt, I think what I'd like to do is I'll share my screen now.
Let me just give you presenter status here.
Sure, yeah.
So I think my screen will start sharing everyone, and then Bobby's going to take over.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do with the group is just take a couple minutes and quickly show you the website and all the different interactive features that you'll find on it. So can you see that okay, Matt?
Yep.
Perfect. So if you go to, first I'll go to speaking.king.ca. That's kind of the landing page for the township's various consultation processes. So if you land on the page, you'll find all the township's different projects going on. There's these kind of neat little progress bars in the corner to tell you generally where the project's at. So the rural zoning bylaw review is right on the front, the bottom right at the moment. So you click on that, and this is our main landing page for the entire project. So this is where we'll keep things posted, we'll keep things up to date. You'll find a brief description of the project here. Just looking up at the top right, this is where you can sign up for project updates on the Stay Informed field. We've posted some FAQs, just some general questions about, that might come up that many people may have. And if we get the same questions from multiple people, I think we might elaborate on those FAQs as we move along. Some links on the side as well. Under important links, there's a few opportunities to look at the township's interactive map to check out existing zoning. You can check out the existing zoning bylaws by clicking on that link. And then there's also a link to the official plan. So I kept mentioning the official plan in the presentation. So maybe you're curious if you haven't seen it before. And then in terms of, just moving down, so there's some project timeline information under documents. This is where you can download our draft discussion paper if you want to have a look at that and offer comments. Kristen's contact information in the bottom right. And then sort of in the middle of the page, there's a few opportunities for interaction. So there's a news feed that we'll keep posting regular updates on the project as it moves forward. There's an interactive map. So if you click on the map button, you'll see a map will pop up with some sort of instructions about what we're kind of looking for on this. So if you click on the map itself, it'll open up a new page. And usually it tells me to log in. It's not doing that this time. So maybe maybe that's been disabled so I can actually see the whole thing now, which is great. So when you enter the interactive map, what we're looking for here is for people to kind of post pins and post comments. And there's two kinds of pins. There's green pins. Actually, this is where I have to log in here when you click on the pins. So you will have to sign in to use it, but once you do, click on a green pin. We're kind of looking for information about agricultural operations, agricultural businesses. You know, I kept emphasizing the opportunity that we have to refine the provisions for on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses. And I think if members of the farming community can, post information about, what's happening on your property or a business maybe that you're interested in seeing in your community, those kinds of thoughts would be really beneficial to us. And then there's a blue pin if you just want to add any other kind of comment. If you want to just make a comment about the zoning, drop a blue pin. So that's the interactive map. I will go back. There is also under the Q&A tab, you can actually post questions. You can post questions there, and myself or Kristen will be responding to those questions. So please feel free to utilize that tool. And then under the survey, we've posted a fairly simple survey. I won't click on it, but it just asks some general questions. So I think what we're trying to do is just create as many opportunities as possible to get people involved. That's really what our emphasis is, especially during COVID. So I think with that, Matt, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Bobby. Everyone, just give me one quick sec. I'll get my screen back up and running. Applications. All right, my screen should be up now. Okay, so as I mentioned, following the presentation, we are going to jump into the question and answer period. And one thing I did forget to mention at the beginning is that I do recognize some people on this meeting are joining us via telephone and may not be able to use the chat box. So once we get through the chat box questions, if there are any, I'll certainly open up the floor and invite anyone to ask their question, and we can do so then. Just in the interest of time, we are trying to ask you to maybe limit your questions or comments to 3 minutes. And after that, we'll point it to either Kristen or Bobby to provide an answer or a follow-up. Once we've made it through the whole group, or anyone who has questions, we'd be certainly happy to take a second round of questions as time permits. As I mentioned before, please use that chat box to enter your question, and I'll pick on those in order that they're received and ask if you'd like to unmute yourself and address the group, or I can certainly ask the question on your behalf. Let me just make sure I have everything here. Yeah, and as Bobby mentioned, if you'd like to follow up with the project team one-on-one, if you're not comfortable with the group setting, that's totally understandable. So please visit the speaking page that Bobby just walked through for contact information or to submit your question, because your input really is vital as we get into the details of this process. Okay, so I don't actually see any questions in the chat box. A quiet group today, perhaps? Oh, we might have one now. Okay, so Russ, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or I can certainly do that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us. I was just kind of interested. I live inside the Oak Ridges moraine off 27 and wondering if, how likely it is that, the new zoning laws would allow myself to build like a second structure on our property for my parents, basically.
Great question, Russ. I'll pass that to Bobby first to provide a response.
Sure, it's a great question. It's hard for me to comment unless I'm able to kind of look at your property sort of in detail. I wonder maybe, I don't know, would it be best to maybe have a follow-up discussion or to reach out to Kristen and we can help to answer that question for you?
Yeah, for sure. Anything that, just trying to get an idea of, if it's something that may happen, could happen, or is never going to happen. But yeah, I'd love to, rehash it or talk to you in detail when the time's right for you.
Yeah, sure. So if you do want to reach out to chat about your property specifically to Kristen, that'd be great, and we can set up a conversation. I think at a high level, we are absolutely through this process going to be looking at looking at second suite structures, and we are looking at the potential need to contemplate second suites in the form of detached structures, because that's now required by the Planning Act to be considered. So it's certainly on our work plan here, but happy to have a follow-up as well.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thanks so much. Now we have a few questions, just great. David, do you have a question you wanted to run by the group?
Yeah, I had two. I guess my first question would be for the secondary uses beyond on-farm uses or secondary residential for somebody wanting to run or establish a business out of a rural property. And I'm just envisioning the on-farm uses like you had mentioned and given the example of a mechanic fixing farm type of equipment. And I see that that is a home-based business would normally be confined to the house or the primary dwelling. But when you talk about automotive, or not automotive's the wrong term, I apologize, that mechanic that's doing repairs on a tractor per se, I mean, that's not something that you could reasonably do from inside the structure. So would this zoning bylaw be a tool to enable that type of activity? And then I have an unrelated question to follow up with afterwards.
Bobby, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Councillor Boyd. Good to see you again, by the way. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, certainly I think what you're describing makes sense. So, you know, in the rural context, we'd be looking at both home-based businesses and permitting that, as well as potentially home industries, which I think could be a little bit broader and a little bit larger in scale. You know, it could be something like a mechanic operating out of an accessory structure. I think though, you know, the kinds of permissions that we introduce, whatever they are, I think they're going to have to be associated with regulations and requirements, right? Like it can't be too broad. We've got to be thinking about compatibility. We've got to be thinking about the rural character as well. You know, one thing that comes to mind when you describe sort of a mechanic operation, it can be impactful, right? If you're thinking about a small lot next to another residence, you know, maybe it's not appropriate to have one there. So maybe one of the provisions we introduce is a minimum lot size. So if you want to have something really large scale, maybe you need to have a certain size lot. So I certainly think we're going to be really open to contemplating things very broadly, but ensuring that they're being properly regulated for compatibility and other reasons. So I hope that answered your question.
No, it does, and I certainly agree with you that compatibility is of the utmost importance. It should truly fit within the zone and, you know, serve the community that it lies within. My second question was more geared towards the hamlets and the built form. We talked a lot in the urban area zoning bylaw of established neighborhoods. So recognizing hamlets like Lasky, for example, where there may be very large, deep lots where your standard controls such as side yard setbacks and maximum lot coverage may not be enough to regulate the built form of that established neighborhood. Are there other tools that we could put in place to ensure that what is being the new form of build fits within the community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is going to be one of the key changes and the key topics that's on our radar for sure. So in the presentation, I showed, you know, at least 3 of the hamlets, and I think, you know, maybe 4 of them are largely zoned HR, right? They all have sort of the same zone. But when you look down at the different streetscapes, and you look down at the lot fabric, and you look down at the aerial imagery, and you go through these communities, you know, you see that there's a lot of distinction. There's a lot of variety, right? It begs the question, you know, can you have a one-size-fits-all zone for the hamlets? And I would think likely not. I would think that we're going to likely have to break that down to better reflect the character. We can introduce a whole bunch of different provisions to help manage that. So that might involve, you know, regulations related to setbacks that differ than the ones today, requirements on height, and certainly I think a lot of the ideas that we carried forward in the urban bylaws, as you'll remember, I think will be relevant here as well in the hamlets. So, you know, I think we'd be looking to do something similar. And part of where I'm coming from is, you know, the basis for making changes, you know, there's a lot of reasons, but the official plan is one of them. And the official plan has changed in the hamlets, right? The hamlets have designated the official plan has designated the neighborhoods of the hamlets with a fairly restrictive set of policies. So we got to make sure that our zoning bylaw is going to be consistent with those restrictive policies. So I hope that helps, but happy to take a follow-up.
Nope, that you answered that well. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you, Councillor Boyd. Angelo, did you want to perhaps ask your question, or I can certainly ask it to the group?
I think Angelo is speaking, but I can't hear him.
Oh, you might be muted there. I can unmute you here. Okay, I can ask your question to the group, and perhaps you can follow up if I miss anything. So Angela was just wondering, when you modernize standards or when you modernize the bylaw, does it mean more restrictions?
It's a great question. I think the answer to that kind of depends on the topic and where you're looking at. I think it might mean, you know, I think modernizing the bylaw might mean more restrictions, but it might mean more permissions too. A couple of examples. So, you know, the mature neighborhoods that Councillor Boyd was talking about, you know, I can see us tightening up the requirements in those zones. That was certainly the direction that we took in the villages. So I think in some cases there might be some tightening of provisions, but I can see there being instances of broadening as well. The on-farm diversified uses, I think, is probably the best example that comes to mind. You know, I don't think the current zoning bylaw addresses that topic very comprehensively, and I think that the new zoning bylaw should. I think that we should introduce, you know, broad permissions, but like Councillor Boyd was saying, you know, making sure that they're being regulated so that they're ensuring compatibility. So yeah, so I hope that helps to answer your question. It's a bit of a mixed bag. You know, it kind of depends on the topic.
Thanks, Angelo. Pat just left a comment just saying that the province does seem to support secondary residences, and certainly do through some of the changes they've introduced recently. Okay, that was the remainder of the questions in the chat box. Does anyone else have any questions? And do feel free to unmute yourself, and or if you have video, just raise your hand, so to speak, and we'll be happy to take those.
I'm not sure, Matt, if Angelo has been able to resolve audio issues now.
No.
Okay. You know, we can always have a separate chat, Angelo, if you'd like to, you know, yeah.
Great idea, Bobby. Thanks. Okay. Give everyone, I guess, a second to ask, but if there's no other questions, you know, we certainly won't keep you much longer than we need to. Okay, I'm not seeing any other in the chat box, and no unmuted voices today. So I'll take that as questions have been asked and answered. Again, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. You know, it's great to connect with the community, and as you mentioned, this was the third of a series of open houses. So it was great to see quite a few people join each session, which is awesome. So again, thank you. Oh, we might have a chat. Yeah, and so again, thank you for joining us. As Bobby said, we do look forward to connecting with you again in 2021. with possibly some one-on-one conversations or workshops. And then again, once that first draft zoning bylaw is available. The speaking page that we walked through today will have all the latest and updated information. So we do encourage you to check that out at any time in the project. If you have questions or want some more information or would like to subscribe or to the project mailing list, or would like to reach out to anyone on the project team. As I mentioned, a recording of today's session will be posted on the speaking page at this point next week, once we have all three open houses together, and we'll get all those videos uploaded. So you can certainly review this session or share the link with others. And we do encourage you to fill out that survey and that interactive map that Bobby walked through. That's some really important information that'll help us as we start to develop the rural zoning bylaw. Again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Kristen, Bobby, and myself will be on the line until 8 p.m. So if you'd like to speak with us as more people trickle off, we'd be happy to take those questions, or we'll certainly be here. So this will conclude sort of the formal end of the open house, but as I said, Bobby, Kristen, and I will be here and happy to continue the conversation until 8 o'clock. Thank you again all so much, and have a great rest of your week and happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Angelo, I see you're still on the call. Let me see if I can try and unmute you on my end if you want. Yeah, it's not, let's try this here. Angelo, can you try going again now? I think you're unmuted. No, I hit unmute on my end, but I don't think it's working. If you go to that gear setting that Bobby mentioned at the beginning of the call in the top right corner, there's an option there to select what microphone you're using. So I don't know what device you're on, but you might be it might be coming through another device or another microphone. So we can perhaps that setting might help. I'm not sure. Oh, looks like you're dialing in there, Angelo. Hello to everyone again who's still on the call.
I have a question for Kristen.
Yeah.
I went to the draft copy of the rural bylaw today, and I clicked on the map, and I could see the Oak Ridges Moraine designations, but can you zero in closer in a particular property on the mapping system?
Is that which link are you using? The zoning bylaw or the map, the interactive map that we have on Speaking on the rural zoning bylaw page?
Honestly, I can't remember. I did download the draft, but at the same time, I went to a map. I think it was within the draft, though.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not.
If you're using the interactive map that Bobby shared with us during the presentation, the one where you can drop the pins, there is the opportunity to search by address.
I did search by address.
Okay, and that one, all the information that it includes is just the boundary of the Oak Ridges Moraine and the Greenbelt Plan, as well as the boundaries for the villages. In terms of more detailed mapping, the townships just has we have our rural zoning bylaw up, or the entirety of the township zoning bylaw available.
And it zeroes in on every particular property within the Oak Ridges Moraine. It gives it different designations in the hierarchy of the Oak Ridges Moraine. That one doesn't do that, I don't think.
No. And is there a particular zone that you're looking for, or area? Maybe after the meeting, I can get you some information on
my
that.
particular. I'll actually email you, Kristen, if that would be okay, because I'm interested, obviously, in residential units within rural. Okay.
In the Oak Ridges Moraine, the Oak Ridges Moraine plan is fairly restrictive when it comes to secondary units. The province has kind of put out that mandate for secondary units, but where there's other more restrictive policy like the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan, we have to ensure that all of our planning decisions are in line with it. So the Oak Ridges Moraine Plan is a little bit more restrictive when it comes to secondary uses, or sorry, not secondary uses, secondary dwelling units.
I think within my property, within the Oak Ridges Moraine, there's 3 separate designations.
Yep.
Like a hierarchy. Okay. So I was wondering, within the least protected, you could do it.
Within the countryside area, I believe you can have one within the main dwelling. So if the dwelling is in this countryside area, you can have a secondary unit within that main building. So like a basement apartment, or even if it was just attached to the main dwelling in some way.
Attached, would it have to, it would probably have to remain on the same well as septic, is that right?
Perhaps, or expanded system if you needed any additional capacity in the system.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks so much. Anyone else on the call have any questions or comments? I'm happy to take those. Looks like Angela's trying another means into the meeting.
Got it now.
There we go. Hello.
I got it now. Technology is great, isn't it?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Maybe some of you don't want to hear me. But my video doesn't come on. Is my video on? Oh, share video. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, there we go. Yep.
So what, we're the last of the brave ones to stay on this late, or what?
You bet.
I do have a question though. Sorry, I had to go to my settings apparently to turn on my mic. I didn't even know such a thing existed. I learn something new every day when it comes to technology. So anyways, thanks for that presentation. It was really good. Bobby, it was good. And Matthew, for putting the slides in the right place at the right time. It worked out really well. So
Thank you.
I was wondering, I have Spray Lake up at the top end of the township, not the top end, just north of Highway 9. Do you know where it is by any chance? Yeah.
I love Spray Lake.
I love Spray Lake too.
I love it.
I'm just wondering, with short-term accommodations and so forth, and is that would that fall into your what you're trying to do in terms of your rezoning? That's why I asked you about, is it going to be more restrictive? Is there going to be some consultation with the property owners in terms of what's going to go into certain areas and what is not? Is that your intention?
Yeah, so certainly we'll need to be taking a look at permissions for that and taking some direction from the official plan as to whether they're permitted or not. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the consultation will continue, right? So I'm not sure, Angela, if you're signed up to the notification list, but I think we'll certainly have provisions and we'll have an approach kind of laid out as part of the draft zoning bylaw in June of next year. So I think your questions will probably become more clearly answered at that point.
Well, I'm kind of excited because I've got a whole new plan as well for the whole recreational end of it, and short-term accommodations, and people having a place to stay in King Township. We have a big plan going on this winter. Due to COVID, I thought, wouldn't it be nice? My grandkids have a place. They can't go to the Tri-Sand Center to go skate. They can't do this, they can't do that. So I thought I'm going to put 2 ice arenas at the Spray Lake, and I don't know if you saw it on the Instagram or on the media there. We're going to put 2 ice pads there for the public to be able to go skate, and also have kids go and rent some ice and do some skating as well, to play some hockey. They're not big arenas. We're going to put 2 arenas in, and outdoor arenas, I should say, in case the building department's listening.
That's what I was saying.
It's outdoor arenas. So, and plus we're going to have skating on the lake. You're going to be able to go skate around the lake. So you'll do a 3-mile skate and some cross-country skiing. So yeah, I think it's one of those things that we have to do, and that's what we're trying to make it, as a leisure and outdoor activity location. So we're hoping that I hope we fall within your zoning criteria and so forth. Not that I really asked anybody.
Well, I think what you're describing is a bit different than some of the things that we're contemplating in this process. Like it sounds like you're describing more of a major recreational use, right? Which I think under the current official plan would have to go through an OPA and a rezoning process. Yeah, like when I was talking about short-term accommodations, I was referring more to like individual houses where someone might own a house and they rent like a basement apartment for a couple of days to someone in town or something like that. So not so much relevant to like a campground kind of a, kind of a concept, just to clarify what I was getting at there. Maybe
that's how some people can get their kids out of the house, just by telling them they can't do that anymore. I have lots of my friends who have their kids still living at home. They're trying to figure out a way to get them out.
I need to rent it out. You gotta get going. That's hilarious.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, you have to leave now. There's no short-term accommodations anymore. So, but yeah, anyways. Sorry. I hope you guys aren't living at home. But anyways, I know there's a lot of my friends have their kids at home and stuff. So, but have you had some good turnouts on the other 1 and 2 meetings that you had?
Fantastic. Yeah, Matt, what were the numbers in the end?
I think for the first session, both were just above 30, around 35 a session, which is pretty great actually for a virtual evening session.
Well,
and today was 25 or 24 we hit maximum. So
yeah, I tried to get on the first one. I had some technical difficulties, and then the second one, unfortunately, I was at a meeting for the chamber. I couldn't connect on. It was at the same time.
Got it.
So, but today I
you
finally
could
got
join us
on.
for today. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I had to do today. I wanted to hear the presentation. I think it's a great thing to do. I was wondering, since we have Stephen with us, is this going to be presented to the Sustainability Committee as well? Are we going to resurrect the Sustainability Committee, you think, and go through some of these things maybe?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I've been trying to do 2 or 3 things at once, and unfortunately probably haven't done anything very well. But first off, it was a great presentation as usual, and I think we got some maybe limited questions, but good questions. Yes, Angela, we are going to resurrect the Sustainability Committee. It's just a lot to do, obviously, with COVID and the ability to host the meeting and arrange the meetings. But yes, we will tie in with the committee when or at appropriate points to give them an update on where we are and seek their input on some of these factors for sure.
Yeah.
I'm not really at this point really sure to what extent we'll be asking them for their involvement, just because zoning is a little bit outside their mandate, but certainly in perhaps with some of the things I think Bobby was talking about with sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The WAPAs, is it WAPAs, the wellhead protection areas, and things like that, we can probably seek some input from the committee. But we'll have to wait till the zoning gets a little bit more advanced so that they have actually something that they can chew on and give feedback on. It's very difficult, as I think we all know, to look at a very broad document and ask for specific input. So I think what I'd be looking for is to go to the committee with some specific areas that we will be seeking feedback and input on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, so it's good. I guess I've heard from some other members, and they just asked if and when what they were if it was going to continue on as far as the Sustainability Committee or what was going to happen. I wasn't sure myself, but I certainly didn't have any answer. But I understand probably Josh is really busy with his climate committee as well. And that portfolio that he's looking after. So I'm sure they can't wait till Sarah gets back so he can pass it back on to her.
No, we're certainly not going to wait that long. The problem is, and it's a little bit unique because it's a committee that is a different level than, say, the Committee of Adjustment and certainly the Committee of the Whole, but it does allow public input. So, but they can't talk. So it's just how to balance those things. Plus, in all honesty, we haven't had any heritage meetings as well. I'm not sure about the accessibility committee, but it also boils down to the resources, because the IT staff have to help, and they're running from hither and yon to try and keep all the other IT needs going. So it's sort of a combination of all of those factors. But I have it on my list of things to do over the Christmas holidays to figure out how we can reintroduce those meetings and when we can. Plus, we also have to go back and talk about the refresh, which is still occurring, but again, that's because of all those factors here, kind of a lull as well. So we need about, for every staff we have, we need about 3 more of each. So you just ask Kristen. She's a great example of being taxed with so many different jobs. So anyways,
well, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Conversation.
Thanks so much, Angelo.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, and I'm gonna sign off as well. And I'm glad I got through my technical difficulties, and I was at least able to speak to you. And I want to wish you guys a Merry Christmas in case I don't talk to you again, and have a great New Year. And let's hope this New Year brings us without COVID.
Hopefully.
That's for sure.
Thank you, Angelo, and same to you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care, Angelo.
Yeah.
Bye, Angelo.
I'm signing off too. It was very informative, and Merry Christmas to you all, and stay safe.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Have a good night.
Bye.
Good night. I think we still have a couple people on the call that we might not have heard of. Does anyone who's remaining on the call have anything they'd like to chat about, or questions they might have?